quickly, I'll give you all a little bit of background about who I am and what Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry is all about. My name is Ebony Lewis. Once again, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That is where I grew up, went to school, all of that good stuff. And I have the privilege and honor of working by day as a director of leadership and service and health and wellness for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Milwaukee. And in 2016, I lost my cousin to suicide. And that is when I began to pen the love letter entitled Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry. I will talk a little bit more about my family history, so I won't get too much into the depth of Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry. But that's where that came from. And in 2019, August of 2019, I published and released Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry. I also had my son that same time, literally 13 days apart. So it was a lot going on, but ultimately I wrote this book for him, for my son, for my husband, for my bonus son, for just all of the children, right? Because one of the things I use this book to talk about as well is why representation matters. And so this isn't just for Black and brown boys, but it's extremely important that they see themselves represented in a positive light, as well as other people see them represented in a positive light. Throughout this presentation, I ask that you all interact with me, that you engage with me. So please feel free to use the chat, ask questions. While I'm moving through slides, I'll try to pause if I see the chat button, flash. Olivia, please feel free if any questions or comments come up to kind of let me know. But definitely want to interact with you and excited to share ultimately why I wrote this story, but also to share with you all kind of the process of using this book, and why it was written and some of the things that we can do personally and in the work that we do, and as teens on the journey. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for choosing this workshop. Quickly, one of the main reasons and a few of the things that we'll talk about today is recognizing your story, right? That trauma. As I mentioned, I was able to hear Sam speak, and one of the things that she talked about a lot is that trauma. And a lot of times when we're doing this work, we recognize everybody else's trauma and everybody else's ills and what they have going on, and we don't stop to recognize our own. And so Dear Black Boy for me was really born when I was an adult and learned that there was so much trauma and so much generational history of mental health that had been ignored for so long. And so we're going to address some of those stigmas, maybe talk about the stigmas you all are maybe facing, or the youth who you work with may be facing. And then we're going to look at breaking barriers and promoting healing, because that is the ultimate goal for me, for my book, and really just having that. So once again, use the chat. Let me know who you are and where you're from. Would definitely love to connect and just know who you are. You don't have to turn your cameras on or anything, but of course you all might realize in this virtual space, connection is everything. And so sometimes being able to see a face, being able to chat makes you feel like you're connecting. So please feel free to do so. Quickly, just going to share some insight. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, African Americans are more likely to experience social economic disparities, such as exclusion from health, educational, and social economic resources. These disparities may contribute to worse mental health outcomes. I share this because I learned in this time to really start looking at mental health and access to proper resources as a social justice issue, right? We know that certain areas, that certain people who come from certain backgrounds, their disparities are greater because of lack of resources, because of the lack of proper resources. And so we would do ourselves a huge disservice to pretend that this thing that we're struggling with, or this mental health topic, is just for us, right? It is a larger picture, and social and economically we have seen these disparities. And so it's extremely important that we look at the numbers, right? That we talk about the trends and what's happening, to better understand the youth that we serve and what they may be dealing with. And so according to Ring the Alarm, the Crisis of Black Youth Suicide in America, which is a report from the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force on Black Youth Suicide and Mental Health, in youth ages 10 through 19, suicide is the second leading cause of death. And in 2017, over 3,000 youth died by suicide in this age group. Black youth under 13 years are twice as likely to die by suicide. And when comparing by sex, Black males 5 through 11 years are more likely to die by suicide compared to their white counterparts. Suicide death rate among Black youth has been found to be increasing faster than any other racial ethnic group. I would also point out and highlight that COVID has definitely shifted those numbers and caused things to spike as well. And so I want to be very mindful in this time, and I'm just going to take my own moments, quick moment, but for anybody out there that may know someone that died by suicide, for anyone that has had their own battles with mental health or mental illness. I just want to take this time to have a moment of silence. Um, just as we process and move forward, I like to be mindful that we don't rush through certain things, that we don't jump through certain things, also so that things can be felt. I also see that there's a hand raised. So I'll take about 10 to 15 seconds just for that moment of silence. And then if the person who raised their hand wants to speak or put what they needed to say or any questions in the chat, feel free. Thank you for joining me in that moment of silence. And I just want you to once again think about this as we move through this. A lot of it is recognizing our own story, right? Recognizing our own trauma, but also being aware of some of the disparities that exist and just getting the support and getting the help that is needed. So, recognizing your story, your trauma. As I mentioned, many of us, when we're doing the work, right, we're youth, we're educators, we're psychologists, therapists, social workers, we work in schools, education, any of those backgrounds, right? We can recognize somebody else's trauma. We can, recognize what they're going through, any of that very quickly, typically. But a lot of times, it's not that we can't recognize our own, it's that we've ignored it for a really long time. And so, because I am a storyteller, I like to tell the story of Superman, who is this young man in this picture. He looks so much like my son that it is daunting sometimes. But this is my father. This is Robert Jasper Haynes Jr. And this is him when he was a young boy. And I share Robert's story because my father, in this picture, I imagine he, from this picture, had great potential to go on and do great things. When my father was a teenager, and this is all just from things that I've heard and stories that have been passed down, he experienced abuse, both physical, sexual abuse. And by the time he became 18, had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but it was at a time where people didn't talk about mental health, where it wasn't real. And so I would imagine that is why his diagnosis was ignored for as long as it was. And so you'll learn a little bit more about his story. But a lot of times when I start with that, I think of stigmas, right? And I think of the stigmas that have stigmatized so many of us, myself included, from seeking the proper help, from taking care of our mental health, right? We think of this wheel and it's all interconnected: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, right? They're all aligned. But many times we've ignored one or multiple of those spaces because of stigmas. So I want to pause right now and use the chat, or feel free to unmute if you would like, to just share, let me know what are some of the stigmas that you all hear, that you've yourself kind of carried. What are some of those stigmas, if you don't mind sharing what they are and how they've played a role in maybe stopping you from getting the proper care support that it is that you need.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
So just share any stigmas that you've heard in regards to mental health. So when I think of Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry, part of that is because for so long, young men have always been taught, right, that you don't show weakness. Crying is weak, man up, toughen up, right? So that is a stigma. So what is a stigma maybe that you've heard or that exists in your family, community, or the spaces that you exist, that's hindered you or the people you know from seeking the proper help? And I can also write that in the chat.
How about this? Jimmy is just acting out. Can you hear me?
I can hear
you. Okay. While Jimmy is acting out, maybe he's seeking attention. What can we do to help Jimmy realize that his actions are hurting the family? Or maybe the family don't know how to address, Jimmy's situation. But instead of helping Jimmy, there's like a backlash of punishment. Like go to your room, don't come out, stuff like that. Instead of really seeking, some answers to why Jimmy is acting out like that. Maybe Jimmy doesn't know how to express himself. Maybe sometimes Jimmy get too excited because of receiving a certain toy, but his excitement is too compelling to where it's it becomes a problem or an issue, like he's too aggressive. But that's just how Jimmy is. But instead of asking Jimmy how he feels, it's go to your room, go put that toy up, you can't play with it because you're making too much noise, stuff like that.
Awesome. So I'm typing something in the chat. But so one of the things that made me think about is learning to address different emotions and name them. And so one of the things, we become so heavily stigmatized because we don't know how to address different emotions. So we kind of just name everything the same thing. And then it's just like, oh, he's just acting out, or oh, he just wants attention, right? Instead of really getting to the deep root of what it is that actually may be causing that action, right, to occur. It looks like I also have someone put in the chat, we don't have providers who look like us or understand us. Exactly. And so I mentioned that in the beginning, right? That lack of proper resources and culturally relevant resources. Because you could have a psychologist in your school, and I believe even in MPS right now, Milwaukee Public Schools, they have a department dedicated to psychology and sociology and having therapists or social workers in every school. But if we don't necessarily have people that look like us or come from where we come from, it can be a huge struggle. I know when I first embarked on my therapy journey, most of my time was spent with an older white woman. And personally, I was fine, right, in that space for the most part. Like I learned to make it work for me. And it was really, initially just to get some initial help and support. But as I continued on the journey and as things began to happen, I just didn't feel comfortable in that space because there were other things that I wanted to talk about or I wanted to share that I didn't necessarily feel comfortable sharing in that space. And so I took the time to seek and find the support of someone that, so now I go to an older Black woman. I don't know why older is there, but, so just one of those things that I wanted to be mindful of. But I think for so many folks, when we're searching and looking for help, we don't have the support of people that look like us and come from where we come from. So that further adds to the stigma, because then that means it's somehow not affecting us. That's why we don't have resources, because it's not trauma or it's not mental health in certain communities. It's just they acting out, they're criminals, they're this, they're that's what it becomes instead of telling the real story. So thank you for that. Feel free to share any more, but I do have a list of some. However, I'm going to stop and pause and share a page of my book with you all and read the words. And it goes, Dear Black boy, it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel. It's okay to hurt. That's how you know you're human. That's how you know you're real. I would also be remiss if I didn't shout out my illustrator, Miss Jasmine Grant. She just had a birthday, but she is also a Black woman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she illustrated all these beautiful pages. So I would be remiss if I didn't do that. But this image, to me, it's the opening image, and it really highlights stigma, right? That idea that I can't show that weakness. I have to hide who I am from everyone in the world because people won't accept me this way. Um, and so some of those other, one of the things I think Veronica talked on is just like that he wants attention or he's just acting out, faking it. Just pray about it. Anybody that may come from a spiritual or religious background, that is a huge thing that we see there, especially in certain churches, is just that idea of like, it's just a demon. We just gonna pray it out. It's gonna go away. What happens in this house stays in this house. Mental illness is caused by personal weakness. Mental illness means you're damaged. Toughen up, be a man. Crying, expressing emotions makes you weak. You're just sad, not depressed. It'll go away. You don't need therapy, just take a pill, right? So many times, even recently, I stopped saying chill pill. Not sure if anybody's familiar with the phrase, but when somebody would be overly hyper, right? You have children in the house. It's like, man, just take a chill pill. I started to learn how stigmatizing even just saying that is, because it's this idea that there are pills that can settle us, and many times it's associated with certain mental illnesses. We think about ADHD or certain things like that. And so we have to learn to like kind of unlearn some of these things that we've been saying for so long and passing and very passively, because they can be offensive to somebody who may be on medication for ADHD or an attention deficit disorder. So definitely being mindful of that. And then one of the ones I always share, one of the stigmas that I think blocked me from seeking support and help was that idea that you're too blessed to be stressed, right? If your life is good, if you have all this stuff and right, it's a pandemic and I'm working and I have children, right? Like I have these things, somehow I can't be stressed, because if I'm stressed, I'm now not grateful. I'm not thankful, right? And so that is one that I can say I struggled with a lot in my life, because I grew up and I had support, and I had my mom and I had a stepfather and I had even my dad, even with the struggles he had. And now I'm married and I have a 2 income home, and right, like all of these things that then make me feel bad when my anxiety is triggered, because I'm like, I should just know how to deal with this and handle this because I have all this support. And so I think many times we have to be mindful of those stigmas and how they're affecting us. And please feel free to use the chat if any of the stigmas, or once again, are something you've dealt with or someone you know has have dealt with as well. Next, I'm going to make sure that my mic is turned to my sister, because I want you all to be able to hear this video. But as we continue on the story of Superman, right? I'm a storyteller. I like to use this story. I use this video to highlight what happens when we allow stigmas to get us to a place where we do not seek help. And so I go back to the story of Robert, my father, who for so much of his life was trying to manage his mental illness, was trying to father 5 children, and trying to get the proper support that it was that he needed and deserved, and yet never got it. I think a lot of that is just the stigmas. He grew up in a time where you toughened up, you were a man, you went to work, and you made it happen. And ultimately, my father began to self medicate, and he got addicted to crack cocaine. For 20 plus years of his life, he was addicted to crack cocaine. And from there, he began to have several suicide attempts. I call my father Superman, because I've literally seen him in every situation that could have taken him out, and he's still here to this day. However, in 2000 and the dates are getting away from me because it's been so long, but 2000 and I want to say 13, it may have been 12. My father had a stroke that was caused by strangulation. It was another suicide attempt. And for 2 months, he was in a vegetation state where he could not talk, he could not walk, he could not eat on his own. I then, 25 at the time, took on the role of being my father's legal guardian, and I spent lots of time with him. It was at that time that I learned that my father had been diagnosed with bipolar. I was 25 when I learned my father was dealing with bipolar disorder. So when we talk about stigma, I really feel like it's important to share that story, because for 25 years of my life, my family hid my father's diagnoses from me because of the stigma of what that meant, right? Which I think is extremely, extremely painful, just because I think it was a part of why he was not able to receive the proper support. However, I share this story as a way to shine a little light. This is 2 months after my father's stroke. It happened on both sides of his brain, and so he is cognitively disabled to this day. However, this is a video of when he first started talking again. And so I like to share this to kind of shine a light, right, on everything, but just to also show, what happens when we let those stigmas get the best.
Hang on the mistletoe.
I can't hear it, so if I can't hear it, I assume you can't hear it.
Gonna get to know you better.
Can everybody hear it?
This Christmas, and as we trim the tree, how much fun it's gonna be together. This Christmas, the fireside is blazing bright. We're caroling through the night, and this Christmas will be a very special Christmas for me. Said this Christmas will be a very special Christmas for me. Yeah. Bum, 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 bum.
And so, as I said, can you all hear me now? Okay, just with the video, I want to make sure my sound is still there. But as I said, I shared this many times, just really to shine that light on what happens when we kind of let those stigmas get the best of us, when we don't listen to what is going on around us. And so it was truly my father's story that, was the tipping point in my life to, one, seek the proper help for myself, with some of the things that I was dealing with, but then to also start learning more about mental health. I was working with youth at the time, or actually I quit my job to start working with youth at the time because I was searching for purpose, right? This huge thing happened in my life, and I was, depressed, and I needed purpose. And so that is when I started working with youth, and really, just started to do the work, because I recognized that the work had been ignored for so long in my family's life. So I hope that inspired you all, and it really gets me to the space of really talking about breaking barriers, right? Because my father didn't have that time or the resources that he needed, but I think now I exist in a space where I can break barriers in my family and for my children, and hopefully that will go further. And so I'm honored to be in spaces like this, because I feel like we're all here to do the work, right? To talk about breaking barriers, to talk about how do we get past that. So we've been stigmatized. We may not have access to certain resources, but there's still work that can be done and work that we can do. So when we think about breaking barriers, this is the next image I want to share. We think about, what it's going to take, and it's going to take reaching out, talking to folks, doing the work. So it's all right to let it out, to scream and shout, to talk about what's going on inside. Don't pretend that nothing bothers you or that your pain doesn't count. You have no need to hide. Another image from the book. I'll keep it on here a little. Once again, I just like the images to marinate, and I'm really, really thankful to Jasmine for her beautiful images. But just really, learning to talk to people, to share and talk about what it is you're dealing with, and then encourage those around you to do the same. Many times, and I know as youth supporters, I call myself the youth warrior. But one of those things that I've learned is I don't necessarily have all the answers, and I'm not there to tell them what to do. I'm there to be a support, to provide resources in hopes that they use them. But they exist, and we have to, do the work to find them and look for them so that we can start breaking barriers. And so, what do we need for that? We need to be willing to heal. And that's when I talked about ourselves. We cannot do this work if we are not willing to do the work on ourselves. I know once I got trained in crisis intervention, and I went to Seattle, and I walked in a room, and I was on a training facility with police officers. And I was just like, it was like the CTAC police officer training ground. And I was a little taken back. And I was in this training, and it was a trauma training on crisis intervention. And I thought it was amazing because there were so many police officers or ex-police officers that were in the training with me. But a lot of the work that we did was on ourselves. We talked about self, because how can I go into a situation or a space where I'm de-escalating someone and I don't even recognize my own triggers? I don't even recognize my own trauma that's coming up. And so if I'm not willing to do that work on myself, there is no reason why I should be in a space trying to do it on someone else. It's just not possible. It's like tried it, right? Like tried to do it, and it's just not. And we do more damage in those spaces than we actually do healing. And so, being willing is number one. Accept support. I know many times, and this can come from our trauma, we get in spaces where we don't want support or we don't need support, because to need or want others is, once again, it could be triggering, it could be re-traumatizing. But one of those things is we have to be open to the acceptance of support from our loved ones, from our community, from our village, right? We are all in spaces, whether we're teens or whether we're doing the work, where we are the village. And so if we're doing the work, we want people to come to us. We have to show why support is so important. None of us were meant to go at it alone. We just weren't. And it's impossible to. And so we have to be open to that. Seek the assistance of trained professionals, therapy, counseling, coaching. One of the things I talk a lot about is how I received executive coaching this year. And it was really exciting for me. And I never thought about how that in turn was a part of my healing, right? Learning it was from something that stemmed at work, but that what stemmed at work came from something deeply rooted from my childhood that had to do with the way that I received criticism. And it wasn't until I was in this executive coaching that I got that. And so I just want to ensure that we talk about those things, because therapy can be scary to some people, right? You say the word therapy and people run. I don't need therapy. Or we look at therapy as this thing like, when something's bad, I go to this person and I talk to them. No, therapy is something you should do regularly and ongoing and consistently, because one, it's nice to just talk to somebody. If you're like me, you like to talk. But two, it's just a nice outlet to have in any situation, right? But if that scares you, or counseling, right, seems a little scary, coaching could be a start. And there are lots of folks out there that coach in personal or professional settings. And so I always like to share that. Next, practice meditation and mindfulness. The mind is a powerful thing. It is a powerful thing. Listening to Samantha speak earlier, right? Every day, something is happening. Things are changing. Triggers, they don't go away. You learn how to adapt and adjust to them happening. If something happened to you, I know if any of you have been in trauma settings or you've received trauma informed care, we talk about that fight, fight. Why am I tripping on the word fight? Flight or freeze, right? And it's one of those things where we've been trained to react in these ways. And many times it's from something that has happened. That doesn't necessarily go away, but you can retrain yourself. And the only way to retrain your mind is through meditation, is through mindfulness. And I'm not saying through meditation where you sit somewhere in a quiet space, if that's not your thing, right? But finding different things to meditate on, finding different things to pour into you, finding different trainings, workshops, circles that you're in, or friendship groups that you're in, right? To really help with that. Because if you're not mindful about what's going into your mind, what comes out of it is going to be a result of all of that hurt, all of that pain, all of that trauma. And so being very mindful that we're feeding our minds goodness and greatness. And then incorporate movement into your daily routine. And this is naturally, I think a lot of times we look at, some of those disparities that I talked about earlier, and we look at how sports has become a huge connector piece for our youth, right? Like sports is the thing. And many times that is because of this felt trauma and needing an outlet or a release. And so we see how routine and movement can help us, but we also have to be mindful that we're using it in the right way. Right. And we're not just going to play basketball every day or play football every day or do this every day and then still ignoring that deep rooted work that needs to be done. But just incorporating that, especially during this time, we're in a pandemic. Encourage your youth, yourself, right? Get up, do 30 minutes in front of, use a YouTube video, walk around, walk outside. The groundhog was wrong. It looks like spring is coming early over here, at least in my neighborhood. We've been getting some 50-degree days lately in February, early March. So one of those things to definitely do. Anybody have any thoughts, any comments, anything you do for your own mindfulness, meditation, any daily routines, or just anything? I always want to be mindful to pause as I move through my presentation. Use the chat or unmute. You can raise your hand, and if you raise your hand, then I'll know that you're trying to speak, and then you can unmute. Music. I'm sure most of us can attest that music is something we use. Um, Anything else, especially when it comes to youth, when we talk about that message, dear Black boy, it's okay to cry. Anything, I think music and art, right, are definitely great forms to release and to definitely encourage dance, art, right? Art. I'm gonna scream art is something how we think about the disparities, right? And we think of all the things that they took out of schools first, all the things we don't fund when our budgets are cut. And they're many times the things that our children need the most. Do you think just sitting in a quiet space and sitting with your thoughts is that? Oh, of course. I would say so double-sided to that. So it is absolutely important to have quietness and stillness, but ensure that when you're in spaces of quietness and stillness, what are you feeding your mind? Because example, if I go through something very traumatizing, and I have all these thoughts in my head and then I run to a space to be away, it could be a dangerous space depending on my own mental health issues, depending on some of the things that I may be battling with to be alone. And so that's why that finding something to meditate on, mindfulness, any of that, right? So for me personally, every morning when I wake up now and every evening, and I try to do it every morning and evening, I have a 1-year-old. So sometimes I at least do it once a day. I have an app where I meditate for 15 minutes alone in the bathroom in quiet because it's extremely important and valid and effective for sure. But I'm not just sitting alone quiet. I'm being fed something that's training my mind for the day, that's training my mind for my rest at night. So that when I'm sleeping, because I am a very anxious person and I do battle with anxiety, I even battle with postpartum anxiety after having my son, I had to start retraining my thoughts. He's in daycare now, and before the thought of sending him to daycare frightened me. Something's going to happen to him. Somebody's going to bite him. Somebody's going to punch him, right? You see all these crazy videos on the news, right? Of folks, doing things. And so that is what's in my mind. So then if I'm alone with those thoughts, it might not be as effective. But if I'm alone and I'm meditating on the word, or I'm meditating on, I go to God for my meditation, right? I'm meditating on the Bible. I'm being told, and my mind is at ease. So now I know that he's being protected. I'm praying protection over him when he's away from me. Um, so thank you for that. Communication, family time. Family time is huge. Getting outdoors, reading fictional stories. They help me escape from reality. Yes, or watch it. So I watch lots of shows that help me escape. Um, I'm laughing because my husband always makes fun of me. But those shows, they become your family and you connect with them. Grey's Anatomy is one of mine, but I sometimes just have things that I go to and connect with. And they kind of become a release, right? Like, whew. And some of those things touch on things that we deal with as well. So I think fiction is really, really great. Anything else, please share. And I think these are great to think of when we're talking to youth, right? Because many times when we're trying to teach folks how to channel their energy and channel their emotions, we have to know what to tell them to do. We can't just tell them to stop being angry and punching the wall all the time. If that's their outlet, we got to give them something to do in those moments of anger that will help them. So one of the things whenever I'm with my youth, I teach them about meditation. We before COVID. I'm so sad we weren't able to do our retreat this year. But we have a retreat, and when we're there, it's optional because I never want to throw anything on anyone, but our youth can come at 8 o'clock in the morning before the day starts and do a 15-minute meditation with the staff. So one of those things that if we're practicing it, we're also teaching our youth to practice it as well. Please feel free to continue to add anything else to the chat. But I will continue talking about rewriting or telling the story. In this, I talk about rewriting Superman's story. What now? it's one of those things where I definitely had to be mindful that I was given, the power to take on something very great and very huge, and that is generational trauma. Um, we all have it in some way, shape, or form. We all are affected by it. And I think for so long, we get in a space of just accepting that that's the way things are. So that's the way that they have to be. And I am here to tell you today that that is one of the biggest lies that we are told, right? It's just the way it is, just let it be. And it's not. We have the power to change it, and we just have to be very intentional about doing it. So we have to come to things like this. We have to learn. We have to teach and share things with our students and our families and our friends, even if they're reluctant to it. Right? I wrote a book called "Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry." Not everybody thinks that that's true. There are some youth who I share this book with, and they go home, and the book probably would get thrown in the trash if certain people saw it, right? Because these ideologies are still very present today. So we have to be mindful that we're rewriting the story. And I share, images of my family, of my husband, of my children, because this is why I do it. This has nothing like I have to be healthy, very much so, but I want to be able to leave something so that when I'm not here, my children have practices and ways of doing things that were very different than when I was growing up. Because had I adapted to what I was viewing when I was 11 and 12, it would have been drugs, alcohol, right? Like it would have been the things that I was seeing someone else do to deal with their mental health struggles. And it wouldn't have been therapy and counseling and doing the work and writing, right, and telling my story, because there was a time where speaking about my story in platforms like this would have been frowned upon. There is someone very close to me to this day that is very pivotal in my story of learning about mental health, and I don't share their story because they're not comfortable. And so I share my father's because I'm in a space where his story got to a point where it was like, I can no longer allow that to be silent because it's hurting people. And when I lost my cousin to suicide, he was 35. None of us had a clue what was happening or what was going on. And it was a very traumatizing thing, I think, just for my family in general. So I was at the space where I'm like, okay, do I let this continue to happen and just kind of sit back and accept that this is the way things are? Or do I do something about it? Even if people are mad at me for sharing and speaking up, people's lives are at stake. And I know even earlier in the session, there were several questions that came in for Samantha about, what do you do when people aren't trying to listen? I'm sure there are many people that see this book or see the title and don't want to have the conversation because man up is still what they tell their sons and their boys when they cry, right? So I think we have to be very, very mindful of that. And I will challenge you and leave you with the question, and not that I'm ending, but one of the questions I will ask is, what are you doing to rewrite the story on your life, right? They told you wouldn't make it. They told you were just like this person, or this would happen to you, or what happened to you would define you. How are you rewriting that story? Because I think, once again, when we talk about healing, when we talk about breaking barriers, we have to be intentional about what we're doing. And so I love seeing everything everybody is doing for meditation and for taking care of themselves as self-care piece, because it's extremely important. But I want to ensure that we're being very mindful of that. And understanding that it's bigger than me, right? I'm not gonna say it has nothing to do with me because it has everything to do with me. But when I'm no longer here, it's so Ooh, I didn't mean to go back. I share that song because it's one of my favorites, "Bigger Than Me" by Big Sean. But I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. If anybody's like, how do I contact you or reach you, or where can I learn about the book from, get the book from? Definitely want to share my information, but definitely want to take any questions. Um, And I believe Olivia is probably our timekeeper. I'm sure we have time for them. So please talk to me, engage with me. Let me know what you think, what you thought, any thoughts, questions, comments.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question or use the chat. You're good on time, Ebony. So if there's anything else you wanted to share with us, you have that space. We are at 3:15 right now, so
Awesome,
there's
awesome,
there's time.
awesome. Well,
Um,
yeah. I do want to pause for questions and comments. Um, just because I always believe in it, I don't want to leave with just everything I gave. I definitely want to ensure that what you came to get, you got. So that's why I encourage questions. One of the things that I can do that I've not done yet in a workshop, but I could read the book for you all before we close out, if that would be something you'd enjoy. Um, I do share several pages, but would definitely be willing to do that. I do have a question. It came as a direct message, so I'll read it aloud, but I won't say who shared it. But what are some first steps we can take, hold on, sorry, as students to break the stigma? I think just one, doing it for ourselves, right? Not allowing what someone is saying to you to block you or stop you, which is hard, right? And it takes courage. If you want to go see a therapist, but the people in your house are like, no, we don't do that. Don't talk about what's going on in this house. That can be very traumatizing in itself and can set you back. And so I think finding that safe space, maybe it's not a therapist to begin, but maybe it's a teacher, an educator, right? It's someone who you can be open and honest with, and say, I don't have access to this in my home, or I don't have access to this here. How can I get the proper support? One of the things that is very eye opening to me is when I work with my youth now, I have so many youth that are just like, yeah, because my therapist was like, and I'm just like, oh my goodness. Like that, there was a time where I never heard youth talk about, especially, young Black boys or young Black and brown boys. Like that was just something I never heard. And so now, I find that it's really empowering, to like talk to a group of youth and for someone to mention that and to share that very openly. And so I think, not being afraid to share the journey, right? We do not go through things I once learned, and I'm religious, so I'll share from the way that I received it, but I'd encourage you to receive it in your own way. Um, I was, in a session and learned, and someone said, God will not waste an ounce of your pain, an ounce of your pain, meaning every single thing that you have been through or you have endured has a greater purpose. And I think once we recognize that, it really can be empowering to say, how do I take this pain and transition it into purpose? And it's not going to happen magically, right? Like I think we think there's like this mystical, magical way of things happening. No, it's going to happen because I'm on this plane and I'm writing this love letter to my cousin entitled Dear Black Boy, It's Okay to Cry. And for 3 years, it sits in my phone. And then I finally get to the space where I'm like, I need to share this message with others. And then it transitions into a book and transitions into different spaces where I can share. So I think if you're a student currently, ensure that you're being intentional with doing the work for yourself, seeking the proper support, seeking the help, and then being transparent in your safe spaces, right? Be mindful of the safe space, but being very transparent about that journey, because somebody might be in need of therapy and you may mention going to therapy and they're like, wow, my friend, my peer who looks like me, who, right, goes to therapy, maybe I should reach out to them and see who they go to, or, see what was that step. And the only way we're going to break stigmas is by doing the work, right? If we have more Black and brown men speaking up and sharing and engaging with their children, right? And even women, many times one of the biggest questions I always get is, who is this book for? Or how do I use this book with, students if I'm, and can I use this in a classroom of white students, or can I share this story with my young girls? Yes, yes, and yes, because everyone needs the message. And outside of the message, everybody needs the representation. if we only read stories of people who look like us and come from where we come from, we're never going to understand other people around us and their story and their journey. And the issue for so long is that Black and Brown stories have not been being told by us. So I want young women to read this story and understand that as I'm raising a Black boy and he falls or he wants something, that disappointment is a real thing. And when I'm disappointed, I don't necessarily act right. So I can't expect my 1 year old to do the same thing. But yet I walk in Walmart and see a kid getting cussed out because they asked for some Skittles, right? I see that trauma being passed down. And it's like, man, he wanted a bag of Skittles and you said no, and he's disappointed. Disappointment is a real feeling. Has anybody in this room ever felt disappointed and been excited about it? Probably not. And so we have to be mindful that our children are channeling those same emotions. And if I'm only having those conversations with one group of people, the other person isn't getting that message. And so I can't raise or interact with a man properly in my space if I'm not learning their stories, if I'm not engaging with what it is that they may be experiencing or going through. I got a few things in the chat, and feel free to unmute as well. Some of my things in the chat are going to take me a second to read. So, Aaron, I see you have unmuted. Feel free to go ahead, and then I'll chime in.
Okay, thank you so much, Ebony. I really appreciate your message and excited to see your book. I work at a high school, and I'm a psychologist at the high school here, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate a point that I think you made early on, and that is about therapists and getting help, getting a counselor, a therapist. I think it's like a lot of the kids that I work with, a lot of the young adults that I work with, they've maybe had a little taste of therapy. They've had a little taste of it, an experience at some point, and it turned them off because it either wasn't helpful or, worst case scenario, it made it worse. And I feel like I just wanted to kind of reiterate the point that therapists, there's a million of them out there. And if you don't find the one that works with you, that fits you, that feels right, that you actually feel comfortable with on that first try, don't give up. You know, there's so many out there. And I hear you on the challenge of finding somebody who has a shared living experience. That's really important for some people. And we need more mental health providers for sure, that look like our young people.
Thank you for sharing that, Aaron. And I think, even I had to learn that in my own journey. And it's very much like, trying to find the perfect, and I would use shoe, right? If you're a shoe person, but just trying to find something when you're looking, right? Many of you, if you're a youth, you might not be in the space of looking for a home yet, right? But home ownership or car searching, right? It's one of those things where many times it's going to take a few like tries. And that's why we have to be very open. We have to be very open in our mind. Many times we can tell when someone is not in tune or not in touch with where we've been through, what we've gone through. And so being open to that, also leaning on that village, right? Because when we lean on the village, many times you have people that will do the work for you, and not do the work for you, but help you do the work, right? And so I share that in saying I have several friends, and I think I'm in a space that I really appreciate because I'm connected, right, to all these, like to therapists and psychologists and social workers and people that are just in my peer group. And there's a young gentleman that did some work for me. He did like a poem for an event I had, and I learned in working with him that he also was a therapist. And he's, I think, in his 30s, very young. And recently I had a friend, a coworker, reach out. Her son is 17 and needed, a therapist. And I'm like, I would suggest this person. And I had not been to this person for therapy, but I could tell from, the work that he did when he came in person to an event I did, and just from following him and engaging, I'm like, okay, I would recommend him. And she was very open that like my son has tried this, it hasn't worked for us, you know, and she reached out and her son loved the therapy session. Is like, I want to go back. But it was being able to identify those resources for her that I was excited that I was able to do. And I think that's why if we're here and we're doing the work, it's extremely important to, you know, work on enlarging that network so that when our students are coming to us, we can refer them to culturally relevant resources because it's huge, right, Aaron? If we say, oh, go to therapy, and now you're a young man who's maybe 13 or 14 and you're dealing with something, and now you're in front of a, you know, 50-year-old white woman and you just don't feel connected. And it's not to say that she's not good at what she does. It's just to say the experience may not translate well with you. But if you're in a room with a 30-year-old Black man who may have been where you've been, they know what you're going through, they may be able to approach the situation very differently. And I would also say, I got a question about, you know, like the price of therapy and what if someone can't afford therapy? Um, the work is being done. I just saw an article the other day that an old building here in Milwaukee is being turned into the behavioral health department just bought the building and is turning it into a mental health hub for teens. Um, I don't want to be rude and like pull out my phone while I'm on here, but I am going to find the specific details for it because I share that to say, you know, the work is being done, right? It's happening. It is going to take time. But yeah, former Milwaukee Youth and Family Center transformed into mental health hub for children and teens. And that is here in Milwaukee. So I know some of you are in Green Bay and Madison. But just know that that work is being done in many cities across this nation. And if you are a provider or a educator, you know, be that support, be that village in the waiting, right? um, they can't afford it or don't have access and resources to it, just be that support in the waiting and then do the best you can to find the resources. One thing that I always did with youth that I was just texting, I was on Google, right? Like I was always, you know, Miss Ebony, I need to find a space. I don't have anywhere to sleep at night. You know, like I'm trying to figure out what are those resources that exist that I can send their way. I don't necessarily know or have access to them right away, but I'll do what I can to find them. And so I think, you know, unfortunately, one of the things that we recognize is that, you know, mental health and just health care in general is a social justice issue. So when folks are on the front line fighting for Black lives, it's not just because of what's being publicized, it's because our students don't have access to proper education, our families don't have access to proper health resources, right? So this fight is so much bigger than us and bigger than what we even see sometimes. And so, and recognizing that, I think just utilizing the resources that are there and being the best support you can be in the waiting, right? Because the work is being done. I feel like I'm fortunate, and I would express that to all of us that we're growing up in a time where things are a little different, right? They're not where they should be, but work is being done. It's being done and it's happening, and we're all affiliated with organizations and groups and resources that are a part of the work. And so I don't take that lightly that I was invited to be here to be a part of this workshop because that is a part of the work. When we talk about it, when we share what's needed, that's when somebody can go out and make it happen. And so that's what I would share. You know, if you have someone who can't afford therapy or is in a low income part of Milwaukee, just know that there are resources. They may take longer to find, but the resources are there and the work is being done. And then I also had another question, just in regards, I won't read the whole thing because I don't want to share anyone's story in detail, but just one of those questions, once again, is how can you ask for help or who can you talk to when you may not have support in the home? And, you know, one of the things I encourage is just don't shy away from that village. I know it can be hard, right? When we are leaning on, you know, people in our home to be there for us because all in all, that is their job and that is how we approach the situation sometimes. But many times we also have to understand that our families, and I had to learn this from my own family history, right? My dad had his own trauma. I may not have been able to go to him for all of the things I needed when it came for that love, right? When it came for that support. And so I leaned on my mentors. I leaned on other family members outside of my home because I knew that is where I could get that. I I work at the Boys and Girls Club now. I was a product of the Boys and Girls Club growing up, right? So one of those things where we just have to be mindful of our village. The village exists for a reason. I know it's a cliche. It takes a village to raise a child, but I would not be who I am today without my village. Um, and I'm very grateful that I recognized my village. And once again, just be mindful, test things out, ensure safe spaces are safe. Because I know that that can be a barrier when you're seeking support outside of your home. Well, why would I trust this other adult if I wasn't able to trust this adult in my home? I know that can be tough, and I know it can be challenging. And so I think it's all about that open mind and being intentional. If you're in spaces, you might not walk in the first day and be ready to share everything with everyone. But if you're in a space for a long enough time where you can fill out the space and really feel that person is a support, lean on that person and let them know what it is that you need, and then see and kind of walk with them on that journey of finding that support. And so I hope that answered that question, and spoke to that comment. I also sent a private message, as well, with some more insight. And feel free to utilize my email if you have questions, comments, concerns. I always believe that nothing is by chance. And so I'm here with all of you today for a reason. If there's anything you need, any support, right, I would like to be that. So utilize my email address, reach out and let me know how I can be of support.